We are waiting for Council Bluffs police to release the name of a pedestrian who was killed in a crash Sunday night. Officers were dispatched to Veterans Memorial Highway and Twin City Drive around 6:30. They discovered that two people were walking across the street in an intersection when a car drove through, striking one of them. The report did not indicate who had the right-of-way.